evening, everyone. Welcome to the Charleston County Public Library. Can you hear me in the back okay?
No,
it's not. I have to turn the button. The on position. On position makes a difference. Now, can you hear me in the back okay? And you can hear me? Okay? All right, good. Well, welcome everyone to the Charleston County Public Library. My name is Nic Butler. I'm the public historian here. And I work upstairs behind the scenes. You don't see me when you come in. Say, get Nick out here. I want to ask him a question. That's what I'm here for. And I'm so gratified to see so many people here this evening. I think that has a lot to do with the fact that there was a newspaper, front page newspaper article, Post and Courier, 21st of October 2013, that alerted you to this topic, and that's why you're here tonight. But I want to assure you this is just part of a regular schedule of local history talks that go on here at Charleston County Public Library, at the main branch and at other branches. And I have been circulating, I don't have a copy of it down here, a small half sheet of paper with a list of upcoming events. If you didn't get one, there's a stack of them in the back of the room. You can get one on the way out. I just wanted to make sure that you knew there were other similar kind of events, all kinds of different topics. So if you like tonight's program, then come on back for more. Sometimes it's me talking, and I'm sorry if you get tired of listening to me talking. Sometimes it's other historians, other authors, archaeologists, personalities in the community who are involved every day in doing the local history stuff. So if you like local history, this is the place for it. We're free and open to the public always, and we have better parking than any other facility in town. And I want to remind you also that the Charleston County Public Library publishes a monthly calendar of events, and this is the October calendar, and this is online as well at www.ccpl.org. Come to any branch of the library and pick up a copy of it. Everything that I do at the library like this is in the monthly catalog. So if you want to add yourself to some kind of an email list, tonight's program, you'll notice on the title here says that I represent the Charleston County Public Library and the Mayor's Walled City Task Force. Some of you know all about the task force, some of you may not have heard of it. If you go to walledcitytaskforce.org, you'll see announcements about every one of the programs I'm doing as well. And you can even subscribe yourself to that blog site if you'd like to. And I'll mention that again at the end of the program. By way of introduction, let me just tell you a little bit more about myself. I'm a music historian primarily, but now I'm doing all kinds of local history. And the program you're going to hear tonight about the hornwork, Charleston's Tabby Fortress, is one installment in a series of lectures I've been doing about urban fortifications in colonial Charleston. So I'm going to be talking about the 1750s and the 1770s and 1780s today. But if you'd like to learn more about this topic of Charleston's urban fortifications from the early days of this town, then come back for more programs. Charleston was the most heavily fortified British city in North America from the 1680s to the 1780s, when this town was finally demilitarized. So Charleston has a century-long heritage of being a very militarized city. And I've been doing a series of programs about that topic, and I'll begin again in January of 2014. I'm going to start the clock over and do a series of 12 programs each month during 2014, starting from the 1680s and going through the 1780s. And as I repeat these programs, some of you may have heard me talk about these topics before. Every time I do this, I try to add in more bells and whistles, because I'm learning more about this, and I'm refining my knowledge and parsing the notes that I've taken and working towards a book on this topic. So there really needs to be a good book about fortifications in early Charleston, because it really defines so much of the early city. So I'm working on it. And tonight, you're going to hear one small part of that project. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started and tell you a little bit about the outline of my program. Let's see if the technology is going to work here. Here's the outline for tonight. I'm going to try to define some of the terminology that I've used, and I know that everyone here is not an expert on 17th century and 18th century military architectural terms, and so I'll try to define some of those. And then I'll give you a timeline of this hornwork, when it was put up, when it came down. And I'm going to try to do an hour-long program, just half about the history of it and half about reimagining and reconstructing it. because like it said in the Post and Courier on Monday, I really want people to get an idea of how massive this thing was, because I think that the community would get more excited about protecting and identifying and celebrating the hornwork if you could just look at that slab of Tabby in Marion Square and figure out exactly what it is. And that's not very easy to do, so I'm here to try to facilitate that. And to talk a little bit about the design and my theories for how it was designed, and a little bit about some archaeology that has been done in Marion Square, and suggest that perhaps there could be further archaeology in Marion Square to learn more about it. So, if you have questions along the way, you're welcome to ask. I may have to repeat the question because there are a lot of people in here who may not be able to hear very well, and also we're recording this, and I want to make sure that I can answer properly. Okay, so first of all, what is a hornwork? That is a piece of military engineering terminology that doesn't make a lot of sense, but think about horns on a bull, two pointy bits sticking out from the face of a bull. Well, a hornwork is really the same thing. And I'm going to give you this quotation from John Mueller, who's a German-born engineer who taught fortification at the Royal Military College in Woolwich, England. And he published many books on this topic, and he tells us that a hornwork is composed of a front and two branches. The front is made of two half bastions, hold on to that idea for a second, half bastions and a curtain that connects those two half bastions. The parapet or front wall of which is 12 feet high, and generally serve to enclose some buildings which cannot be brought within the body of the place, or to cover the town gates, which is exactly what we did with our hornwork in Charleston, or else to occupy a spot of ground which might be advantageous to an enemy. And here is a textbook illustration of what a hornwork looks like. And by the way, in the 17th and 18th century, there are lots of fortification textbooks. Engineers, military engineers went to school, learned out of fortification textbooks. And thanks to the magic of the internet and facsimile reproduction, you too can own textbooks on how to build fortifications. And I've got some illustrations here for you. So a half bastion you see illustrated here. It's not quite a full bastion. A full bastion would be a diamond-shaped feature, and here that's just half of a diamond. And they're connected by a curtain line. Curtain's just a straight line. And that's really similar to the hornwork we built here in Charleston. Here's another image. This is a late 17th century diorama or scale model of a hornwork at the entrance to the city of Menin in Belgium. So here is the hornwork. There's a half bastion, another half bastion, and the curtain line connecting them. And here's a view of another surviving hornwork in the French town of Le Quesnoy. And what you see here is the curtain, and down here in the foreground, which looks like earth, this is one of the half bastions, and opposite to it, at the top of the screen, is the other half bastion. And there's a big moat in front of it with a bridge leading to the gate in the middle of the curtain, almost identical to the hornwork that we had here in Charleston. We even had a wet moat or muddy moat in front of it as well. Actually, I think our hornwork here in Charleston is a little bit bigger than this one. Okay, also I have to remember that not everybody knows what tabby is. Tabby is a mixture of oyster shells and lime and sand to make a kind of cement. And this is an image I took this summer at Fort Dorchester, just a few miles away from here. That's what tabby looks like today. And also, military engineers knew about this in the 18th century. John Mueller, who I quoted before, says, and he's talking about materials for building fortification. There is likewise lime made of all sorts of shells of sea fish, which is esteemed to be exceeding good because it dries and hardens in a short time and it saves great expense. So it's cheaper than bricks, it's quicker than bricks. If you've got a paucity of stones in your community, like we do here in the Low Country, we don't have stones to build fortifications. But we have quite a number of oyster shells and all kinds of shells, so we can grind that stuff up and turn it into tabby. And that's exactly what people started doing here in the 1750s. I'm going to mention here in this quotation from February of 1757, the commissioners of fortifications. The commissioners of fortifications were a group of men who were appointed by the governor in colonial South Carolina, and their job was to superintend all construction building, fortification building in Charleston. So they would determine the plans and approve the plans and pay all the bills. So the commissioners of fortifications were really the overseers of all the fortifications. In February '57, the commissioners of fortifications agreed to make a trial of Tabby work at Fort Johnson. And you may know that in Beaufort, just a few miles south of Charleston, Tabby had been used for building residential structures for some time. But here in Charleston, we were kind of hesitant to use Tabby. In 1757, we made a trial use of Tabby, reconstructing part of Fort Johnson. It worked really well, and all of a sudden, Tabby's all the rage in Charleston in 1757. So let me move on to the timeline. There's so much I could tell you about the horn work and what happened before the American Revolution, during the Revolution, afterwards, and I'm just going to hit the highlights. You know, if I told you everything that occurred at the horn work, we'd be here for a few hours. So in the interest of time, let's make it pretty quick. And I'm going to back up to the early 18th century because I want to talk about town gates. So here's a map of Charlestown, published in London in 1711, and it shows you 62 acres of a walled city that we call Charleston. And you may have seen this image before. Here's another version of that same image that was drawn in October of 1721. Here it is, October of 2013. John Herbert drew this map for the newly arrived governor. And I want to point out the streets that it shows there. At the bottom of the screen is East Bay Street. At the top of the screen is Meeting Street. And at the intersection of Meeting and Broad Street, there are two drawbridges and a gate. So you go over a drawbridge onto a little island that's surrounded by water. Turn 45 degrees, go over another drawbridge through the gates of town. Charleston had big swinging wooden gates with giant iron strap hinges holding it together there. That's our first town gate at the intersection of Meeting and Broad Street. And that stood there until about 1733, 1734, something like that. And then we were at peace, we took down the walls, and a few years later, we're at war with Spain and France again, so we built a new town gate, just a few yards further north. And on this map from 1745, you see that in that year, 1745, a new line of fortifications were built. This is an earthen wall with a 30 to 40 foot moat in front of it, Queen Street at the bottom of the screen. That line of the fortification here is actually what we call Market Street today. And at the intersection of Market and King Street, there was a pair of drawbridges on a little island leading into the town gate at the intersection of King and Market Street, where the Riviera Theater is today. And then we outgrew that. The town is expanding. During the French and Indian War, there were many plans to build a system of elaborate fortifications around the peninsula. And this plan was put into effect in 1755. We went way over budget and way behind schedule, and the engineer was fired and the whole plan was scrapped. But that was the subject of last month's fortification lecture, so I'm not going to dwell on that too much. What you're looking at here on the screen, I know that's a very faint image. This is a drawing, a plan of a project to fortify Charleston made by a German engineer named William de Brom at the request of Governor James Glenn in November of 1752, just 2 months after that destructive hurricane that ruined all the fortifications of Charleston. And this is a map that I got from the National Archives of the United Kingdom. And that's why I haven't plastered it on our website on the internet, because I don't have copyright permission to do that. But I have copyright permission to show you in this free event tonight. So let's zoom in and look at that peninsula of Charleston. Over to the left-hand side of the screen is White Point Garden. And right down the middle of the screen is the town limit. Beaufane and Hazel Street today mark the limit of the town in early Charleston. In 1769, they made a new town limit, which they call Boundary Street. We call it Calhoun Street, and that's way up here. And you'll notice right underneath that Calhoun Street area, Mr. de Brom has designed what he called a very large citadel for 2,000 men to occupy. We didn't have 2,000 soldiers here at that time to occupy that one position. But the idea is similar to a hornwork in that here's the end of the town, and that great field, open field in front of the town needed to be fortified, the approach to town that an enemy might take. So he proposed building a giant citadel, which never happened because he went way over budget, behind schedule, and he got fired in 1757. So what happened after DeBrom? That's still a good idea to have a citadel there guarding the way into town, but maybe not one that elaborate. So in the aftermath of DeBrom, in May of 1757, the General Assembly of South Carolina here in Charleston ordered all those fortifications that DeBrom had started to come to a halt. Forget about that, we're going to fire him. And we're moving on. And almost immediately after that, a new person arrived. In mid-June 1757, the Royal American Regiment, that is the British regular regiment of troops, the 60th Regiment of Foot, sailed into Charleston Harbor by way of Philadelphia, including, and this is a quote from the newspaper, a gentleman who is skilled in military architecture. So a new guy who's replacing Mr. DeBrom. In mid-June of 1757, those commissioners of fortifications, by the way, we have the journal, surviving manuscript journal of the commissioners of fortifications. We have that on microfilm upstairs if you'd like to read through it. The commissioners of fortification considered the building of a magazine at Dorchester and determined, quote, tabby works will be much cheaper and better for the wall than brickwork. So remember I said tabby's all the rage in 1757. So the commissioners of fortification are very interested in building something at Dorchester to guard a magazine, and they want to use tabby, and there's a new engineer in town. So here's a photograph that's 30-odd years old showing some archaeology going on at Colonial Dorchester, which is a state park that everybody should visit. And you see those standing tabby walls in black and white. Well, I went there this summer, took a photograph. Here's my photograph of those standing tabby walls that were built in 1757. Go and inspect them yourselves. So there's tabby work going on. There's a new engineer. And the engineers are Henry Bucket, or Bouquet, Emanuel Hesse, who came here in June of 1757. Henry Bucket is the colonel, the commanding officer of the 60th Regiment of Foot, the Royal American Regiment. He's German mercenary working for the British Army. And he brought with him an engineer named Emanuel Hesse. Emanuel Hesse may be German, he may be Swiss, don't know. He didn't live long enough to tell his story, unfortunately. In late June 1757, our South Carolina governor, William Henry Littleton, says the following to the South Carolina General Assembly. I now have the pleasure to acquaint you that the Earl of Loudoun, who's the commander of all the British operations in North America during the French and Indian War, the Earl of Loudoun has sent Captain Hesse, a good and able engineer, and Lieutenant Colonel Henry Bucket, who commands the forces, is also very well versed in that art. These gentlemen are of opinion that new works are necessary to be constructed without delay, as well here at Charleston as at Fort Johnson on James Island, to prevent this place from falling an easy prey to the enemy in case of attack. So we were expecting the French might attack Charleston. You and I know they never did, but at that time they're seriously worried about that. So they began construction, the beginning of our story of the Hornwork. On the 10th of October, the commissioners of fortifications waited on His Excellency the Governor, who delivered to them the plan of the works to be carried on across the town neck, that is the middle of Charleston Peninsula, and recommended to them to carry the same into execution with all convenient speed. So there we are. There is a plan for this hornwork that has been delivered to the governor. I have never found that plan, and I'd ask you to go look under your beds and in your closets and your attic. Somebody's got to have that plan somewhere. And just a few days later, the 27th of October, the commissioners agreed to meet the owners of the land on the north part of the town, just north of Euphane and Hazel Street, where the new works are to be carried on tomorrow at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So where is that area? Well, here's a Google Earth image of the north part of Charleston. There's King Street right down the center, and what they call Boundary Street that was created in 1769, so that has not been created yet. And you and I know that as Calhoun Street. So the commissioners of fortification, in order to carry on new works across the town neck, purchased 14 acres that you see inscribed in this yellow rectangle. That's everything from Meeting Street on the right all the way over to St. Philip Street on the left. And those 14 acres were purchased just for fortification building. On the 8th of November, Mr. Hesse, the engineer, attended the Board of Commissioners Fortification and informed the board that he had surveyed the land belonging to Mr. John Ragg and Mr. Peter Manigo, which is about 14 acres. That you've heard of Ragboro in Charleston. Well, this was formerly part of Ragboro. On the 12th of November, Colonel Bucket ordered 100 of his men to begin the works across the town next Monday morning. So the works began on the 14th of November, 1757. The work would have begun with digging foundations, digging and digging and digging. So we're talking about 100 soldiers, regular British soldiers, as well as slaves, digging the foundations. By the 27th of December, the commissioners agreed to employ Mr. Thomas Gordon to conduct the Tabby work in Charleston and another in Dorchester. Thomas Gordon was the Tabby King of South Carolina at that time. He had experience building Tabby works, including residential structures in the Beaufort area, and he brought that expertise up here. He is a bricklayer by trade, but he knew more about Tabby than anybody else in South Carolina at that time. So if you see Tabby works in and around Charleston, Thomas Gordon's probably in charge of them at that time. He had cornered the market on it. And then we're skipping ahead to the summer of 1758. Work has been progressing for some time. Governor Littleton and the commissioners of fortifications agreed, quote, that the hornwork at the north end of the town be constructed and completed with the utmost expedition. And in August, Colonel Robert Rivers was paid for 1,352 bushels of oyster shells. And I included that just as a demonstration. We've actually got receipts from this time period for people delivering materials like carpentry materials and blacksmith materials to this. We've got receipts for owners of slaves being paid for their slaves' labor on the fortification, and for boats that were temporarily purchased for carting oyster shells to the hornwork. In September of 1758, Mr. George Ruppel, who is one of the commissioners of fortifications, he is a gentleman planter in town. He's got lots of luxury time. He's also an amateur artist. And Mr. George Ruppel laid before the board of the commissioners of fortification a plan of a gateway at the entrance into town through the hornwork, which they agreed to in order to be carried into execution. And I wanted to point that out because I've never seen that plan. Maybe it's in somebody's attic somewhere. Some of George Ruppel's drawings and papers do survive scattered around the world. He ended up being a loyalist during the American Revolution and took off, and his son stayed here. But I want you to think about this for a second. This hornwork had a gateway, like every other fortification has a gateway. The Castillo de San Marco in St. Augustine has a gateway. Not very elaborate, but somebody had to design it. And think about even Fort Sumter. It has a gateway. Somebody had to design that. So George Ruppel designed some kind of a gateway to the hornwork, but we have no idea what it looked like. So it's not just simply a little drawbridge, wooden drawbridge, going up to an opening in the wall. It's something more elaborate than that. And I wish we knew what that looked like. But back to the building. In 1758, we know that Thomas Gordon is getting paid for attending the Tabby works. And his journeyman is getting paid for overseeing the Tabby works and setting the boxes. And I have an illustration for setting the boxes. I want you to hold on to that thought for just a moment. I'll get back to that. In November of 1758, the commissioners agreed to discharge or fire all the boats on hire and lay up the 2 schooners. Those are the vessels that were bringing mounds and mounds and mounds of oyster shells to this project. And to discharge all the laborers except those employed in finishing the gateway through the hornwork. So the gateway got completed. Maybe the rest of the hornwork was left at some unfinished thing. And that's November of 1758, and 6 months later, the commissioners agreed to discharge all the overseers, all the slaves on the hornwork on Saturday next, and ordered the overseer to secure all the tools belonging to the project and deliver an account of the same to the board. And the last receipt I found is April of 1759. Thomas Gordon gets one more payment for supervising this whole project. Why did they stop in 1759? Because by that time it was abundantly clear that the French were hemmed in by the British way up there in New England and on the Canadian frontier. And it became abundantly clear that the French and Indian War really wasn't going to get down here to South Carolina. It turned into a Cherokee War in 1759. So we in Charleston got the militia together and marched to the western part of the state, North Carolina and Tennessee, and burned the Cherokee into submission. And we stopped worrying about the French in 1759. Here's an image I got from Colonial Dorchester State Park of pouring wet tabby into movable boxes. So tabby is laid in a stratified manner in that you construct these movable boxes that are joined together by these wooden dowels, and you pour the wet tabby mixture into it. It's oyster shells, lime, sand, and water, all mixed up. You pour it into the forms, it dries very quickly. You disassemble the forms, stack it on top of the newly dried material, and make another row. And to do that, to disassemble the forms, you have to pull out that pin and extract the wooden dowel. So if you look carefully at that piece of tabby in Marion Square, it's got several dowel holes in it, and that's a vestige of its manufacture, not a later defect. It's not like bees have been burrowing into it. That's a very typical feature of tabby construction. So after the French and Indian War, Charleston's fortifications were largely abandoned, and there was no sense in completing the fortification, or completing the hornwork. So it was left unfinished. And what you're looking at here is an inset from a much larger 1773 map of Charleston. And I want to draw your attention to the top of the screen where it's illustrating the bastions and town gate. And if you zoom in and look at that, you see that King Street, right in the center of the screen, is guarded by a hornwork. And you should recognize that hornwork design from the illustrations I showed you earlier. And it's unfinished in the sense that it doesn't have a back side facing the town yet. And also look at the top of the screen where you see the scale. And you can see that from side to side, that hornwork is more than 600 feet wide. Solid tabby. How tall was it? Not quite sure. I haven't found very much evidence, but I'll tell you more about that in just a little bit. But rest assured that anybody coming from the countryside into Charleston or leaving Charleston, going to the countryside, had to travel through that gate in King Street. It's straddling King Street just north of Boundary Street right here. So everybody coming into town complained about the narrowness of the gate. It's probably only wide enough for one wagon to go through at a time. Okay, so we know a little bit more about the hornwork from the American Revolution, specifically from the British siege of Charleston that occurred in the spring of 1780. And from that time period, I'm not going to tell you everything that happened at the hornwork because we'd be here for too long. But we're lucky enough to have a number of images that the British published during and after the war. The British were very keen about their successes in North America and like to celebrate them by publishing maps back in England. So here's a map published under the auspices of General Henry Clinton, who won the siege of Charleston and took over the town in May of 1780. And this was published to celebrate the success of that operation. It's usually called Clinton's map. We have copies of it upstairs if you'd like to see it. And I'm going to draw your attention to the center of the screen, the hornwork, and zoom in on that. And this is one artistic rendering of the hornwork that I think is rather misleading. It's not quite what the hornwork looked like at all. But I want to also point out that the hornwork here, which straddles King Street, in front of that, it is preceded by a row of earthen works, which are about 6 feet high, 6 to 8 feet high, and abatis, which is sharpened sticks and trees that have been placed strategically to impede the enemy's progress. And in front of that, there's in fact a ditch or a canal connecting the Ashley River, which is over on the left-hand side of the screen, and the Cooper River on the right side of the screen. I don't think that's a very accurate representation of what the hornwork looked like. And it's really difficult to get any sense of scale from looking at that. So let's move on to another image. General Clinton was in command of the British Army that captured Charleston, and he had an engineer working for him named Charles Blaskowitz. And what you're looking at on the screen is a plan that this summer I've got a copy of from the National Archives of the United Kingdom. And again, I don't have copyright permission to plaster this on the internet or sell you a copy of, but maybe in the future I will. But this is, it looks beautifully hand-colored, hand-drawn image. It looks like a printed map. It's actually superior in detail to Clinton's printed map. This is Clinton's manuscript map that nobody in Charleston's ever seen before. Wonderful detail. So again, I'm going to zoom in on the hornwork in the center of the screen. And there you see the neighborhood of the hornwork. Here's that line of fortifications in front of the hornwork and the canal in front of that. Zoom in even further. Look at this exquisite detail. You can see there's King Street leading into town and Boundary or Calhoun Street just below it. So the hornwork, this gate behind it, actually extends about 100 feet or so down King Street. And this is a wonderful map. It's not entirely accurate either. There's some flaws with it, some artistic license, but it's the closest thing I've seen yet because it matches a lot of the archaeological evidence that we found. And if you remember earlier, the hornwork that I showed you a minute ago wasn't finished, but in the late stages of the game, in the spring of 1780, the American forces took this unfinished Tabby hornwork and finished a wall around the south side of it made of earth. And that got done in a big hurry in the spring of 1780. So the area of this that you're looking at is approximately 7 acres in size. And towards the end of the program, I'm going to show you my 3D version of what that might look like. But let's look at some other maps. Here's another map that I found at the British Library, not in person, but through the magic of the internet. And again, I'll draw your attention to the top of the screen, the hornwork, which looks very much like Captain Blaskowitz's illustration of the hornwork. And here's another one made by a German engineer, probably in 1781. He says here it's the old hornwork. Again, very similar to Charles Blaskowitz and his illustration. During the British siege, I'm going to just cover a few details from the siege to give you an idea of how important the hornwork was during the siege of Charleston, because the hornwork was the principal part of Charleston's defenses during that siege. On the 1st of April, the firing began. The British Army had been coming in previous weeks and setting up and getting ready, but the siege began in earnest on the 1st of April. And I want to mention just a quick aside here. There is a great book about the whole siege of Charleston by Carl Borick called A Gallant Defense, The Siege of Charleston. We've got copies upstairs, and Carl's at the Charleston Museum if you want to ask him questions. And then a week later, General William Woodford's brigade was instructed to camp on the right and left side of the hornworks, but no tent is to be pitched between the hornworks and the lines, those outlying lines of fortification. Later in April, the embrasures, or the portholes through which the cannons protrude, the embrasures on the lines are to be repaired by the Negroes entered in the artillery company, that is, slaves in the artillery company. These blacks are to be collected as soon as possible in the hornworks, and they are kept ready to proceed on this business as soon as it is dark. So during the day, the British and the American forces traded volleys, firing cannons at each other. And then at night, we sent slaves out under cover of darkness to repair the fortifications in front of the hornwork. Later in April also, the American forces erected a line of barrels of turpentine and set them on fire at night so that the slaves repairing the fortifications could see what they were doing, and to prevent British soldiers from sneaking up on the hornwork during the cover of darkness. Just imagine that smell and sight of barrels of turpentine burning in Marion Square today. On 28th of April, in one of the diaries that I found, evidence that laborers are working hard to enclose the backside of the hornwork with an earthen work wall. So the front and side flanks of the hornwork are composed of tabby, the back walls are composed of earth. On the 29th of April, General Benjamin Lincoln, who's in charge of the American operations here, designates the hornwork as, quote, a place of retreat for the whole army in the event that a British assault should drive them to the front line. So there are hundreds, maybe a couple of thousand American soldiers lined up in front of the hornwork, hiding behind lines of fortification and firing at the enemy. In case the enemy pierces that line of defense, all the soldiers are instructed to run back and enter into the hornwork. So the hornwork becomes literally a citadel during the siege. And then Charleston surrenders in May. On the 8th of May, at a council of general and field officers held in the garrison of Charleston, in the hornwork, when we decided to surrender to the British, that decision was made in the hornwork by the field officers, the majority of whom voted to request terms. The British offered us terms of surrender. We refused them. Firing continued for a few more days. And then on the 11th of May, a German officer who kept a diary reported, quote, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Americans hoisted a large white flag on the hornwork. So that's the last legacy of the hornwork, a giant white flag waving above it. So Charleston surrenders on the 12th of May, 1780. General Benjamin Lincoln, in charge of all the American forces, and General William Moultrie, in charge of the local forces, meet Henry Clinton and General Alexander Leslie at the gate, literally standing in the gateway that George Ruppel designed, standing in the gateway to negotiate the terms of surrender, just those 4 men. And then later that day, a little technical glitch here. Later that day, small problem here. Well, this is what happens when you rely on technology. There you go. There we go. Let's see if I can. Yes. Later that day, the British and German troops marched under the gate, playing that catchy tune, God Save the King. And I want to point out that phrase, under the gate. So it's not just a simple doorway, but it has a roof over it. It's tall enough that the gateway, which is big enough, high enough for a man on horseback to sail through, and has a roof over that. So try to imagine how high this was. And then the American forces marched through that gateway of the hornwork later the day, playing a French tune called the Turk's March. And they surrendered, they piled their weapons between the hornwork and the abattis, or the wooden fortifications in front of them. So here's yet another map, a French map drawn by a French engineer who was in charge of creating this back wall of earth in 1780. From this French map, I decided to give you that illustration. The place of surrender is immediately in front of the hornwork. Approximately where the new hotel is going to be, the site of the old Charleston County Public Library. That's where the surrender took place. So how did this one piece of Tabby in Marion Square survive? Well, it's not a very long story. After the American Revolution, the city of Charleston is incorporated in August of 1783, and that area on which the hornwork is standing becomes officially within the part of the city limits of Charleston. March of 1784, the South Carolina General Assembly gives Charleston permission. Now, we've been at peace for a year now, so the General Assembly gives us permission to dismantle all of our fortifications in Charleston. And so at the end of 1784, don't know the exact dates, but at the end of 1784, the bulk of the hornwork is razed to the ground. Foundations are still out there in Marion Square, but it's knocked down to the ground. The draw gates must have been pretty substantial. They remain for another decade. And here's a plat from 1784, before all of the hornwork has been knocked down. This is a plat that's at the State Archive. And here you see King Street on the left side of the screen, Boundary Street at the bottom of the screen. And if you zoom in, it says part of the hornwork. And that's literally exactly where Marion Square is today. And the Fort's Francis Marion Hotel is right here. So one half of the hornwork was still surviving at that time. And how do I know that it was taken down? The city of Charleston published its financial records in the early days of its incorporation. So in 1785, in September of 1785, the city published an account of all the money it had spent in the years 1784 and 1785. And I'll draw your attention here. Ditto, meaning cash paid, ditto, cash paid for leveling the hornwork and repairing Boundary Street. So Boundary Street was messed up enough by the extension of the hornwork in 1780 that it had to be repaired. So we know it was taken down. It cost £295, 17 shillings. I don't know how much that is in today's money right off the top of my head. But they had to pay slaves to go out there with sledgehammers and knock this stuff down, just like they knocked down the rest of the town's fortifications.
Is that the left or the right one?
Is that the left or
Right one.
This is the right flank, but what they're paying for here, I don't know. That might have been paying for knocking the whole thing down. And what do they put in its place? Let me go back to this thing. Just a little bit on the north side or top side of this screen is where they put a tobacco inspection station in 1789. You and I know that tobacco inspection station as the old Citadel building, which was built on site of the old tobacco inspection station that was commenced in 1789. In 1795, the city financial reports tell us that the draw gates have been removed and the ditch or moat in front of the hornwork has finally been filled in. In 1799, the city subdivided what we now call Marion Square. The city subdivided it into 40 lots and offered them on long-term leases. The city didn't sell those lots, but all of Marion Square was divided up into lots that you could rent for 30 or 40 years at a time. And some people did that. And we know, for example, from Governor John Drayton, who published in 1802 a view of South Carolina as it existed in 1702. And he says, quote, "The orphan house, which now stands upon some of the grounds where the old hornwork was formerly situated, well known as the strongest fortification on the lines of Charleston when it was besieged by Sir Henry Clinton in 1780. Nothing now remains of this hornwork but what some of the citizens have preserved, either as a wall to their lots or incorporated into some part of their buildings." So that chunk of Tabby and Marion Square survived because it was basically a partition wall between neighboring lots when Marion Square was formally subdivided. Of the wet ditch in front of the hornwork, so wide and deep as scarcely ever to be dry. So it was a wet ditch, not a dry ditch. Not a vestige remains, and houses and gardens covered the site on which it formerly stood. So by 1802, few people remember the glory of the hornwork. How was it built? What did it look like? Well, let me give you some more overview. And some more quotations from eyewitnesses, like Bannister Tarleton, who's here with the British Army, Lieutenant Colonel during the siege of the British, during the siege of Charleston, 1780, bad boy of the American Revolution. He published memoirs later in his life when he got back to England, and he says the defenses of Charleston on the land side, that is on the neck where we are today, on the land side consisted of a chain of redoubts, lines, and batteries extending from one river to the other, and furnished with 80 cannon and mortar. Okay, so what about the hornwork? In the center, to cover the principal gate, a hornwork of masonry had been constructed. He didn't know about Tabby. He didn't look at it up close. It's Tabby, not masonry. Had been constructed, which, being closed during the siege, like I told you about earlier, formed a kind of citadel. So there's one eyewitness account. How about another one? A Hessian soldier employed by the British Army named Johann Ewald, and here's an illustration of him, kept a diary. And we have an English translation of his diary upstairs in the South Carolina room. In his diary on the 31st of March, during the siege, he says, "So far as I can make out, the enemy works were built in the form of a crescent and numbered 57 embrasures. The front is covered by a dry ditch and an abattis, in front of which is a wet ditch and another abattis." He's talking about stretching from the Ashley to the Cooper River. What about the hornwork? Well, behind those works, I saw a higher one, a higher work, the hornwork, consisting of 2 bastions and a curtain. Well, that's just a textbook definition of what a hornwork is. 2 faces of the curtain which present 3 embrasures each. So on the front line of the hornwork, on either side of the gate, there are 3 embrasures on either side of the gate. This work, called the Old Royal Work, is said to have a broad, dry ditch also. He couldn't see it at that time, but a few weeks later he saw it up close. And this name he uses a couple of times, the Old Royal Work. And I was wondering, why did they call that one the Royal Work? Charleston had lots of fortifications, and this was a royal colony. But it dawned on me earlier today, this hornwork was the only fortification that was designed and built by members of the regular British Army, not by colonial militia. This was built and designed by British engineers in the British Army. So it is the royal work of Charleston. So after the siege, this is what Ewald says. Now a few words about the works. On the land side, they consist of a regular hornwork with 18 guns. And regular, by which he means a geometrically logical hornwork, not an irregular hornwork. A geometrically logical, regular hornwork with 18 guns, called the Old Royal Works, the escarp, or front wall of which, is faced with a wall of oyster shells and mortar 2 feet thick. And that's the measurement basically at the top of the wall, not at the bottom of the wall. Again, how tall is it? He doesn't tell us. It has a rather muddy ditch over which leads a stone bridge. Not a wooden bridge, but apparently a stone bridge. Wow. There's no native stone here. It may have been cobblestone or Bermuda stone. It's covered, the door or gate, which is in the center of the curtain, is covered by a lunette of earth. And what it means, the gateway is protected by a triangular shaped kind of revetment at some distance directly in front of the gate. Not right in front of the gate, but some yards in front of the gate. So if you're trying to storm the gate, you'd have to get by that lunette of earth first. This lunette is strengthened by a double picketed ditch. On the city side, that is on the back side or the south side of the hornwork, has a kind of parapet made of earth, an earthen wall, and again, a double picketed ditch all the way around. Thankfully, we have an eyewitness account from a French officer who's on the American side, who was in the hornwork at that time. And this is what he says on the 10th of May. This is 2 days before the surrender of Charleston. He says, the enemy or British batteries, being lower than ours, their cannonballs passed over the lines on the town where they did great havoc. So what does he mean by lower? Well, you have to remember that the hornwork in Marion Square is the highest point on the whole peninsula of Charleston. So if you're back around Spring Street or Line Street, then you're a few feet lower than the hornwork. And I think that's what he means. But then he goes on to say this. Our fire, particularly that of the hornwork, that had a 30-foot elevation, plunged in on their new batteries that were almost entirely destroyed. So is he saying that the front wall of the hornwork is 30 feet high? Or does he mean that topographically speaking, we were on a kind of a precipice and the walls were not quite 30 feet high, but as a sum total of the height of the wall and the height of the topography were 30 feet high? But if he means that these walls were approximately 30 feet high, then that Castillo de San Marco in St. Augustine would have been the same height as our hornwork, of which you only see a small slab standing in Marion Square. So just think about that. I think that might be a slight exaggeration, but maybe not too much. That's something that we need to ponder, and more archaeology might help us determine whether or not that's a valid measurement. And there was some archaeology done in 1998. I want to quickly summarize that. 1998, the city contracted with New South Associates, the field officers of the 4th Brigade of the South Carolina Militia, who own Marion Square, not the city of Charleston, contracted with New South Associates, and Natalie Adams, archaeologist, wrote a report, which we have a copy of upstairs. And she has this illustration in it, showing the excavations that were done in 1998 in Marion Square. So at the top of the screen, you see the old Citadel building, and in fact, the old library that just came down. And you see, in this close-up, you see the outline, the dotted line of where they believe the wall of the hornwork went. And by the way, from King Street on the left side of the screen to the end of this wall over here is approximately 350 feet of solid tabby wall. The foundations of which are still right there in the ground, about 12 inches below the grassy field in Marion Square. So every time you go to the farmer's market, you're walking all over a battlefield. And we know that parts of this are extremely accurate, because here in trench number 5 and trench number 6, Natalie Adams found the hornwork. There it is. Right next to the standing tabby wall, they found in 2 trenches, they found 2 different parts of the wall. So we know exactly the angle at which that wall goes, and the angle at which those 2 walls meet. That is a known quantity. And similarly over here, up there, in trench 7, we know that the wall goes at least that far up. But they didn't dig further trenches up here to determine any of this stuff at the top of the screen. Over here in trench 4 and trench 3 on the right side of the screen, they found the Tabby wall. We know the angle at which that wall proceeds, so we can approximate the way that these walls connect. And Natalie Adams' outline that you see in yellow here is based on that 1773 Cook map, which I think is erroneous. And it's got a slight jog in the middle of this flank, and I don't think it looked like that at all. I think it looked more like this. And in fact, based on the geometry that I'm going to get to in just a minute, I think it actually looked more like that. Not quite as tall. So I don't think it goes very far into that asphalt parking lot that's known as Tobacco Street. But to give you an idea of the context in which this is located, the yellow push pin in the middle of the screen shows you that Tabby remnant, and the white stuff here is an aerial view of a big tent that the city of Charleston put up, and those tent stakes are being driven right into the hornwork out there in Marion Square. There's an overlay with Natalie Adams' map showing you approximately the size of it. So again, I don't think it's quite that big. I think it's more like that. And also, just real quickly, some accidental archaeology. In November of 2007, the city of Charleston's removing a tree from the southwest corner of Marion Square, very near to where the fountain is today. And they ran into the foundation, brick foundation of an 18th century building there. And it may be the building that I've highlighted there in yellow. And it was just very quick archaeology because they were removing a tree stump. But we could return to that site if we had permission and if we had money and do further archaeology to discover whether or not that's what it was. So how else can we learn about what the hornwork might have looked like? And here's a great clue that I didn't know about until fairly recently. This guy, Emanuel Hesse, he designed other things in South Carolina. He designed a big Tabby fortress in Beaufort called Fort Littleton, named for our governor at the time, in 1757. So this guy, Emanuel Hesse, is designing two forts at the same time, one in Port Royal, one here in Charleston, both using Tabby. And I bet you that those two designs were extremely similar in nature and geometry. And fortunately for Fort Littleton in Beaufort, we have not only a really, really good detailed construction record with all kinds of dimensions, but we actually have the original plan. This is not the original plan. This is a plan that you'll find at the South Carolina Historical Society. It's a 1775 drawing, and for many, many years, South Carolina historians have said, well, this is all we know about Fort Littleton, and it doesn't quite make much sense. But the original plan, drawn by Hesse himself, is at a library in California. I'll show you in just a second. And we know he did this because those commissioners of fortification received a plan from Mr. Hesse, the engineer, laid before this board of commissioners of fortification, a plan of the fort to be built on Spanish Point on Port Royal River with the following calculations. These are Hesse's calculations. It's going to take 40,000 cubic feet of solid tabby work, 65,000 cubic feet of earthwork for the parapet and the banquette. That's a little smaller than our hornwork here in Charleston. And here's the original plan. It's at the Huntington Library in California. It's a long story how they got it. But this is the 1757 plan that Hesse presented to the commissioners of fortification. And I'm going to zoom in on this a little bit and tell you about the details. It actually has a pair of walls, inner and outer walls, that you see indicated by the yellow arrows there. And surrounding those walls is a moat or ditch, and then there is an extensive gun platform facing the Port Royal River, which I've illustrated in yellow there. So it's an inner and outer wall that are constructed of tabby and filled with earth. And how did he arrive at those angles? Well, let's do a little exercise, textbook exercise on how to build a fortification. Those angles of the half bastions, and by the way, these are half bastions here, and that's, excuse me, whoops, I pushed the wrong button there, that didn't work. This is a full bastion up at the top of the screen. That's a full bastion. These are two half bastions at the flanking sides. You arrive at those angles by drawing straight lines for the line of sight. And that's a very practical and common way to do that in military engineering. These are not a random collection of angles, but very thoughtfully constructed geometric angles. And notice at the bottom of the screen, there's this elevation. And from letter A to letter B, he's showing you a profile view. And if you look at the top right-hand corner of the screen, you see that same letter A to letter B. He's showing you in plan view and profile view what that section looks like between these two walls. Let's zoom in on that just a little bit. Between these two tabby walls, illustrated in pink here, there is 9 feet of space, 9 feet of space between those, filled with earth. So that hornwork in Marion Square is not just simply a thin wall of tabby behind which there are cannon. It's a 14, maybe 16-foot wide wall behind which there are cannon, just like you would see in illustration here. And by the way, there's Emmanuel Hess's signature. He spelled his name without an E on the end, so I'm not sure exactly how this spelled is. By the way, he died about 9 months after leaving Charleston. He died in Philadelphia and never went back to his home. He was a young man, left behind no records, no family. And he came here with the Royal American Regiment. And about that gateway into Fort Littleton, we don't know very much about the depth. It's a wooden gateway with a drawbridge and a gate. But if you use the scale that Mr. Hesse provided on the map, we know that that gate is about 10 or 12 feet wide. So the hornwork gateway was probably also about 10 or 12 feet wide. And I've rotated that image here because we are going to focus just on that top corner. If you zoom in at top right corner, then that should look remarkably similar to our hornwork in Marion Square. So they have a lot of things in common. So let's take what we know about the hornwork and what we know about Fort Littleton and combine them. And this is my illustration of what I think the hornwork, the tabby part of the hornwork in Marion Square looked like. And what I've done here, the curtain wall, which straddles King Street, is 330 feet across. The whole thing is about 650 feet across. And let me put this into a context for you. Well, actually, before I do that, let me point out, bisecting the screen, down the middle of the screen is modern King Street. I went out with a little wheel and measured the width of King Street, right there next to the tabby, so I could put some accurate measurements in that. And again, how did I arrive at those angles? I'm using the geometrical principle of the lines of sight to determine what the angles of those half bastions should be. Remember, we know the location of this wall, we know the location of that wall, we know the angle at which they meet, and I'm just having to add in a few more features. So here's an aerial view of Marion Square. Let me point out one quick thing. Right down the middle of the screen is King Street, and here's Calhoun Street. These two white objects you see here are semis, 18-wheelers. Those are large trucks, and there is the skeleton of a large tent. So the city of Charleston is setting up for some kind of event. And there's that standing piece of tabby. And here is John C. Calhoun on his pedestal and the shadow thereof. And here's the hornwork. Get an idea of the size. Look at those semi-trucks there.
Wow.
This, if I'm mistaken about this, I'm off a little bit. But this is really how big it was. It was a huge, huge structure. And remember, it was even bigger than this when it was enclosed in 1780 at the end of the siege. And the back door would have been right about here in King Street to the hornwork. So they were capable of holding a couple of thousand men during an emergency during the American Revolution. So again, you get into context of where that standing piece of tabby is. And you can see it's right there in the corner, exactly where that wall turns, just like Natalie Adams found in 1998. But this is a much, much bigger structure. And here's a couple of illustrations from those How to Build Fortification textbooks I was telling you about. These are late 17th century textbooks. And what I was telling Robert Barra, the Post and Courier the other day, is I was working on this model and I figured out, aha, I know the secret. It's half a hexagon. That's what it is. That's how we came up with these angles. It's half a hexagon. So on this illustration, you see a pentagon at the top and a hexagon here. And here's an illustration of how you take a hexagon and divide it up into triangles and determine the angles of the bastions. And here's another book that shows you how to take a hexagon and divide it up and come up with lines for all the bastions. So I did exactly this same kind of thing. I'm going to show you my model in just a second. Actually, no, I'm just going to go ahead and jump right to that. Let's have fun with the model here. All right, so I'm going to have to stand here at the computer. Can you still hear me okay in the back? Yeah. Okay. Hide this. Here is the hornwork, just an outline like I drew a moment ago. And I'm going to grab a tool here and toolbar. Let me grab a circle. So if we take a pen, this is, by the way, this is a product called SketchUp, which you can download for free and have fun with. So if I draw a circle using that point of the half bastion as a center and draw it all the way out so the radius goes to the other point, and then I do the same thing from the other point of the half bastion, and then I draw another circle based on that intersection going out to the other, to the original point of the half bastion. Then I have a structure that begins to look like the hornwork. And actually, that line connecting the two half bastions is actually the radius of those circles. And I can draw all the way around and construct other radii and connect those lines. And we have a hexagon. Oops, that would work. So we have a hexagon. Let me start erasing some lines here. Get rid of some superfluous material here. And it begins to look like the thing you see from the siege of 1780. And if I take these lines, say, connect these two lines, and that center point, connect to the center line. And then find the center of that line, just using basic geometrical principles like you find in all those textbooks. And I start erasing the superfluous lines. Then guess what? It looks an awful lot like that thing that Emanuel Hesse designed in 1757. So if you're wondering about how he came up with the design, it's not a random thing at all. It's half a hexagon, which makes perfect sense if you've looked at those textbooks of how to build a fortification. So here's another view. Here's my three-dimensional view, which I started on this a few years ago. But once I found Hesse's original plan for Fort Littleton, it changed my thinking about it. So what you're looking at here is two computer figures that are approximately 5'10", close to 6 feet tall, standing in front of an object that's 6 feet high and approximately 10 feet long. That's about the size of that slab of Tabby standing in Marion Square. But let's zoom out from that. Let's get the bigger picture. How does that relate to the whole? It looks something like this. That's approximately 650 feet across, straddling King Street. And look at those figures way down there. They look like little ants at that place. And you zoom around, and that would have been the view if you were up in a balloon during the siege of Charleston. And there are 18 cannon on a platform. So I'm estimating that parapet wall would have been 14 to 16 feet thick, and the platform would have been at least 16 feet wide behind that. And we know that there were carpenters paid for lots of carpenters' work building that platform. And what did the gate look like? I don't know exactly what the gate looks like. We haven't found Mr. Ruppel's plan. But remember that phrase that the British Army entered under the gate. So the gate would have some kind of top. But the gate was high enough for General William Moultrie to gallop through on horseback at a high rate of speed in the days of the siege of Charleston. So it looked something like that. And numerous citizens complained about the narrowness of the gate stopping up traffic during peacetime. And it did have a broad moat in front of it. The moat on the left side of the screen in front of the wall is 33 feet wide. That's what Captain Evald said during the siege of Charleston. There's a 33-foot wide moat. In 1998, Natalie Adams found a moat that's 33 feet wide. So that was pretty accurate. And if you look in the center of the screen, I'm trying to illustrate here what I'm talking about with a pair of walls. So I believe that the hornwork was built much the same way that Fort Littleton and Beaufort was built, with a pair of tabby walls. I've illustrated two tabby walls that are 10 feet apart, because this fortification is a little bit bigger than the one at Fort Littleton. And those walls at Fort Littleton are 9 feet apart. Let's make them 10 feet apart. And the walls are, of course, thicker at the bottom than they are at the top. Natalie Adams found exactly that in 1998. That wall, I've made it 12 feet high, not 30 feet high, but 12 feet high. Because you have to remember that when military engineers in the 18th century counted the height of a front wall or escarp, they started from the bottom of the ditch to the top of the wall. So if you count a ditch, and I made the ditch here 7 feet deep, and add that to 12 feet for the wall, that's 19 feet high. And maybe that's approximately how high it was. Maybe I'm off here, but probably not by much. So it's just an amazing thing to get an idea of the scale of it. And when you're standing back at an extreme distance, maybe it doesn't look that big or imposing. But when you really back out with the benefit of aerial technology, you can really get an idea of how big it must have been. And after 2 years of construction, this is as far as they got. They surrounded the back of it with an earthen wall during the siege of Charleston. But it's quite an impressive feature. So in conclusion, there's a lot that we could do with the hornwork in Marion Square. There's a lot that we could still learn about it. This is my guesstimate of what it looked like, based on physical evidence found during archaeology, based on visual evidence from all the maps and plats we found, and textual evidence, the documentary evidence, the descriptions of it. All of those are incomplete, so that we have an incomplete picture. But there are still opportunities for doing archaeology there. Marion Square is not owned by the city of Charleston. It's owned by the South Carolina militia, the field officers of the 4th Brigade, which are represented by the Washington Light Infantry and the Sumter Guards. And the city of Charleston manages it. So in the future, I personally, as a citizen, would like to see better signage down there, explaining to tourists and to residents what the hornwork was, and really celebrating this accomplishment. This was something unlike any other American city. And one newspaper reference I found, and I can't remember the exact date off the top of my head, one newspaper reference I found from colonial South Carolina is talking about someone had dropped their wallet while they were walking through the hornwork gate going in or out of Charleston. And they're offering a reward in the newspaper. But they didn't call it the gate at the hornwork, they called it the White Gate. It's a big sheet of tabby. They called it the White Gate. That'd be, it's a great phrase right there. I think we should celebrate that, put that on some signage, throw some money at some additional archaeology, and really find out more about this. It's a big mystery. Here we are in the 21st century, and we still haven't gotten to the bottom of this. So I hope that you have enjoyed this overview of the hornwork, and I would be happy to take any kind of questions you might have. But I really want to thank everyone for your attendance and for your patience. Thank you. Very much. Okay, so any questions? Yes, sir.
Should we presume that when it was leveled, it went in the ditch?
Should we presume that when the hornwork was leveled, the substance that was leveled went into the ditch? And I think that's probably true. If this were a brick structure, those bricks could have been recycled and taken elsewhere. The tabby was probably broken up and pushed in. But in the archaeology that was done in 1998, they dug fairly narrow trenches, and they really weren't looking for debris, and they didn't open up vast areas that would have been the ditch, but probably a lot of rubble was pushed into either this ditch or other low-lying areas in Charleston. And also, I should point out, Natalie Adams in 1998, when she did that archaeology, she didn't know to look like I would have asked her to do now, to see if there are a pair of walls. She confirmed one wall, but her trenches weren't quite long enough or wide enough to look and see, is there another wall 10 feet or 12 feet behind that other wall, parallel to it? And I'd like to go back and look for exactly that. Yes, sir.
There was mention that there was another fortification built at Fort Dorchester, and was the hornwork then at the southern end of a route that would have gone from that fortification, essentially maybe down Dorchester Road to King Street?
So the question is, there's another tabby structure built at the same time at what we call colonial Dorchester Day. Is that part of the chain, somehow kind of connected on a military route? I don't think so exactly, because what we call Fort Dorchester, and what they called during the American Revolution Fort Dorchester, was designed to be a magazine with a wall around it. So it wasn't really thought about as a fortification. And you look at it, and it's a square-shaped fortification with 4 half bastions. It looks like a fort, but it really wasn't designed to be like a chain of forts. So in answer to your question, I really don't think the military engineers in the 1750s had it in their mind the broad scale of a chain of fortifications like that we would think of in the American Civil War. Yes, sir.
2 quick questions, please. That took a lot of oyster shells. Where do you reckon they all came from? And number 2, how did that document get out to California?
Okay, first question, where did all those oyster shells come from? They're local oyster shells. Unfortunately, we know less about Charleston's hornwork than we do about Port Royal's Fort Littleton, because the commissioners of fortifications are sitting here in Charleston, and all they have to do is walk down the street and oversee what's going on. So they didn't write down a lot of details. But at Fort Littleton and Beaufort, the commissioners wanted to know what was going on without going down there in person. So there's a lot of correspondence where those the people who are actually building this fortification in Fort Littleton are sending lots and lots of letters back telling us exactly who was supplying the oyster shells and how many oyster shells. And we don't have that depth of information about the hornwork in Charleston. So we have a few receipts for some people, like Colonel Rivers being paid for oyster shells. But yes, it would have been a lot of oyster shells. They're coming locally, I suppose, because a lot of oyster shells at the same time are being used in Beaufort for Fort Littleton. A lot of oyster shells are being used in Dorchester for that magazine. So I suppose they're mostly local oysters. The other part of the question, how did this map of Fort Littleton get to California? A map collector, purchased the part of the papers of General Loudon, Lord or Earl of Loudon, who was the British commander of all North American operations during the French and Indian War. And in Lord Loudon's papers was this Hesse drawing. So apparently the commissioners of fortifications here in Charleston took Hesse's plan for Fort Littleton, and they were so proud of it, they sent it to the Earl of Loudon for him to have in his personal collection. And it ended up being purchased later by a collector, and it went to the Huntington Library in California. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Where were the British camped, and how did they come in?
Where were the British camped? I'll refer everyone again to Carl Borik's excellent book, The Siege of Charleston. The British sailed up the Cooper River and the Ashley River and disembarked way up on the neck, up approximately where Hampton Park is today, and they set up camp, and then they started slowly marching down the peninsula towards Charleston and kind of moving in stages. And the British headquarters was on what we would now call Sans Souci Street. That was where the generals were kind of hanging out. But the troops kept proceeding downward during the spring of 1780. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Bucket and Hesse were Royal Army officers, presumably working under the direction of the royal governor and working on a royal fortification. So wouldn't copies of their plans have been sent to their superiors in London?
I would like to think so, yes. He was suggesting that since Colonel Bucket or Bouquet and Mr. Hesse or Lieutenant Hesse were working for the British Army, wouldn't they have sent copies back to their superior officers, like Lord Loudon? And I really hope they did. I haven't found any of those yet. They might be in somebody's personal collection. They might be in an archive that hasn't put their catalog online yet. But it's not at the British Library. It's not the plans for the hornwork, I mean. They're not at the British Library. They're not at the British National Archive of the United Kingdom. They might be in a private collection. We need to keep looking because things surface all the time in the 21st century. So there's still hope that such a thing might be found. And Mr. Rubel's drawing might still be found in some private collection somewhere. Phil, you look like you were going to ask a question.
Oh my gosh, don't get me started. First of all, thanks, it's a great lively presentation. I was actually just thinking and smiling about the irony a dominant nation's fortifications or munitions or whatever, 20 years down the line being turned around and used against it.
Yeah, that's one of the great ironies of these fortifications of Charleston. Some of the last works designed in the most professionalized manner 20 years later get used against the people who designed them and paid for them to be built.
It's a good thing that doesn't happen anymore.
Yes, ma'am, you have
When did Marion Square take on the current look?
When did Marion Square take on its current look? And that's part of the presentation that, in the interest of time, I left out, but I was hoping somebody would ask. It's kind of a long story. The field officers of the 4th Brigade of the South Carolina Militia used what we call Marion Square. They called it Citadel Square. It was used in the mid-19th century for marching and drilling of militia officers and troops. And then in the early 1880s, the city of Charleston worked out a deal with the field officers of the 4th Brigade that the city of Charleston would manage and superintend this area and use it for public purposes. And it's at that time, in 1883, that the little iron fence, black iron fence, gets put around that standing piece of Tabby. When, for the first time, Marion Square, it's actually renamed Marion Square at that time, and it's really open to the public. It's not a military installation anymore. Not solely a military installation. It becomes a public park, basically, in 1883. Any other questions? Okay, no questions, so I'm going to take this opportunity to let you all go. I'm going to stick around and answer questions, and I've got to break down some material. But I want to remind you again, if you're interested in more of this stuff, check out our blog site, walledcitytaskforce.org. If you like tonight's program, then join us for all kinds of local history programs. We've got this monthly calendar. So I look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you so much for your attention.